Hey, good morning, everybody. Sorry again for not being able to be here live with you today, but I did have a meeting this morning with the administration that I have to be at, so I'm doing this via video first before I leave. Um, we're going to talk today. We had talked about some of the impacts of the economic revolutions of the 18th century in the early 19th century and what that meant. And so we talked about a lot of the reforms in Great Britain that made it the more modern state it is. But certainly there are other things going on, and particularly on the continent in Europe, that are affecting the development of modern European states as we kind of know them today. And a lot of that has to do with what we call the nationalistic movement. And so we're going to look at some of the roots of the nationalistic movement here for a couple of days. So, having barely survived the force known as Napoleon on the continent, the aristocracies of Europe wanted to make sure their positions of power were secure. And in order to do this, they met at one of the first very prominent and important international conferences known as the Congress of Vienna in 1815. And here they sought to stabilize European boundaries while also restoring their own legitimacy as rulers. In other words, they wanted to get back to the good old days when they were the head honchos of their respective countries. Now, unfortunately for them, the disenfranchised of Europe weren't so keen on this idea. Ignoring this, the aristocracies went ahead with their plans. In 1815, Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Britain joined together in the Quadruple Alliance, which has come to be known as the Concert of Europe. They sought to return a stable balance of power to Europe, and again, this is not what the middle and working class people had in mind. For instance, in Spain, the common people desired to return to their constitution of 1812. And luckily for them, they were backed by some military officials who knew what they were doing, and eventually King Ferdinand VII was forced to give them their constitution, and Spain became a constitutional monarchy. And seeing a monarchy in jeopardy, France supported the concert of Europe and sent about 100,000 troops into Spain. You got to remember, after Napoleon, they had restored the Bourbon monarchy in France. And so France, again, is a constitutional monarchy. And occurring in the early 1820s, the rebels of Spain were no match for the French force. In the end, the constitution was revoked and the Spanish monarchy reigned supreme. Similar revolts dotted the map of Europe during the 1820s, and unfortunately for the revolutionaries, most of these failed. So, for example, when the Italian areas of Piedmont and Sicily fought for freedom against their Austrian rulers, they were put down. And like the Spanish rebels, they were no match for the forces of Prince Metternich, the uber-conservative, powerful ruler of the Austrian Empire. And the same scene played out in Russia as military leaders desired reform in their country. And sadly for the revolutionary minded, they too were crushed by their czar. So all these revolutions modeled after the French Revolution, the American Revolution, just don't seem to be getting any traction at this time in Europe. So in France, the spirit of revolution took a different turn, as I already mentioned, as Louis XVIII ruled from 1814 to 1824. And under Louis, the various social classes were given some civil rights. However, a group of extremely conservative aristocrats known as ultras wanted to do away with the constitutional monarchy. And to them, an absolute monarchy, what France had kind of been accustomed to in the past since Louis XIV, in which a sovereign is unrestrained by constitutional law, was the only way to go. And although Louis XVIII smartly refused to give in to the ultras' wishes, his successor, Charles X, agreed with their philosophy. And under his rule, Parliament was dissolved and the civil rights of the common class were limited. And this is known to history as the July Ordinances, and this proved to be Charles X's undoing. Not want to take their rights being trampled on lightly based on their experiences in the French Revolution, the common classes of France rose up in rebellion and Charles X was ousted from power. Now, toward the close of the 18th century, the revolutionary bug that had spread throughout Europe and North America made its way to Central and South America, what we call Latin America. And finally, after hundreds of years of European domination, the people of Latin America were ready to ring the bells of freedom. And like the disenfranchised of the American and European revolutions, the lower classes of Latin society had reached their fill. Creoles, mestizos, and mulattoes, who were all of mixed ancestral descent. So they had some European blood. They were no longer willing to take a back seat to those of just pure European blood, and thus revolution came to Latin America. In Haiti, revolution was led by Toussaint Louverture, and as a free man, Louverture led the native enslaved population of Haiti in revolt against their European masters. Occurring in 1791, this rebellion was victorious, seeing the freedom of enslaved Haitians within a decade. And although the year 1802 saw them once again threatened by the forces of Napoleon, who desired to retake Haiti, the freedom-hungry Haitians refused to be vanquished. And finally, in 1804, the Haitians declared their official independence. Now, you got to remember, this is a country, Haiti, ruled by Africans or people of African descent, former slaves. So this is huge in the history of abolition and everything, that Haiti could do this. And of course, its failure and backslide into poverty is seen as a constant scene of embarrassment for people who are looking for equal rights and civil rights. But perhaps just as significant as their success, it rocked the institution of slavery all over the Americas. In Mexico, the Catholic priest Miguel Hidalgo also decided it was time to throw off the chains of Europe. And on September 16th, 1810, he and his followers rose up in revolution against Spain. However, they're not as successful as their Haitian counterparts. Although they had some initial success, they were unable to take the capital city. Hidalgo was captured and executed in 1811. And despite this, September 16th is commemorated as Mexico's Independence Day, not Cinco de Mayo, as many Americans think. Taking up Hidalgo's revolutionary mantle, rebels were finally able to overthrow the Spanish, and in the 1820s, the Free Republic of Mexico was born. Similar scenes played out in Central America as local leaders rebelled against Spain and together created the United Provinces of Central America. And although they began as one, these free areas soon became the independent states of Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and El Salvador. Perhaps the most famous of all 19th century Latin American revolutions actually occurred in South America. And it was led by a general of some military renown by the name of Simón Bolívar, and known to history as the Liberator. A republic in Venezuela began to form under him, and following this, the areas of Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador were liberated, also by Bolivar. And as other South American territories began to rebel against Spain, Bolivar had a vision for the formation of one nation under the name Gran Colombia, or Big Colombia. However, feuding among the groups made this impossible, and instead independent nations like Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador were born from all of this. So in European history, the year 1848 has become synonymous with bloodshed and revolution. It was a year when food shortage, unemployment, and economic depression moved the middle class to rebel against the ruling class. And nowhere was this more plainly seen than the country of France and its 1848 revolution, the Second Revolution. So to get the French Revolutionary ball rolling again, let's take a look at Louis Philippe, France's king at the onset of the Bloody Year. To put it mildly, Louis Philippe was not a fan favorite of the French middle class, known collectively as the bourgeois. To them, Philippe was the epitome of a wealthy, out-of-touch king who cared only for the elite. Sound familiar? The fact that much of the middle and common class lacked the right to vote only increased, if not proved, their opinion of the monarch. And as the middle class strove for more rights, the aristocracy fought to hold their positions of power. However, by 1848, the bourgeois of France had endured, and they were hungry for change. Unfortunately for the people of France, their hunger was not merely metaphorical. The years leading up to 1848 had seen horrible harvests, causing a food shortage and a devastating spike in food prices. And as people began to physically go hungry and as jobs evaporated, riots filled the streets of French cities, people looking for food. And the middle class began calling for reform, demanding fair wage and work practices, as well as the end of inflationary pricing. However, their cries fell on deaf ears, and with each hungry mouth and each riot, political unrest grew. Revolution was in the air. It was a scene very familiar to people who'd been alive 50 years prior. So as usually happens in times of political unrest, France's aristocracy worked to suppress rebellion by further limiting the rights of the disenfranchised. So you can imagine how well this goes over with them. An excellent example of this occurred when the monarchy of Louis Philippe refused to allow a group of political dissenters to hold a banquet celebrating their revolutionary spirit. And this could perhaps be labeled as one of the straws that broke the camel's back. In violence, the middle class took to arms, and King Louis Philippe was ousted from power. And with this, the way was paved for the Second Republic of France. Now, unfortunately for the country, their problems were not solved by the ousting of their king. These were deep-rooted economic problems. And soon new political factions began to form from the very bourgeois that had incited the revolution. Again, it's all playing out the same way it did with the first French Revolution. On one side were those who felt voting rights were the primary concern of the new government. On the other side were those who believed economic reform was of utmost importance. And this latter group, which favored economic reform, was led by a guy named Louis Blanc. And under his leadership, national workshops were established, which provided much needed job opportunities. So think of it as shovel-ready projects, internal things. So you had these workshops where we're going to build this bridge, we're going to fix up these buildings, build hospitals, schools, things like that. However, when those more committed to voting were elected to power, they closed the national workshops created by Blanc and his followers. And this threw France into even more violence as the angry workers took to the streets in violence, protesting the closing of their places of employment. This occurred in June, and this bloodshed claimed thousands of French lives and has come to be known as June Days. In facing such chaos, the Second Republic of France chose to elect a president as a strong central leader. And although this move helped stem the bloody year of 1848, it saw France jump out of the frying pan and into the fire. Because, ironically, the man they elected happens to be the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, and his name is, or at least the name he took, he changed his name, is Napoleon Bonaparte III. Why the third? Well, because Napoleon did have a son named Napoleon, and so he didn't think it right to just discount him and call himself the second. So in spite of his cousin, he called himself Napoleon Bonaparte III. And within a few years, he would take the power of president and make it so great and strip the French of their political rights and declare himself, you guessed it, Emperor of the French. So the French is now an empire again, and their emperor, ironically again, is Napoleon Bonaparte. So there's an old saying that goes something like this: when France sneezes, all of Europe catches a cold. So although there are a few different versions of this saying, they all mean pretty much the same thing. If something starts brewing in France, it usually ends up affecting all of Europe. Excuse me, and perhaps never has this saying proved more true than in the bloody year of 1848. And this chaos would soon lead to the election of one central figure within France. His name we've already mentioned, Napoleon Bonaparte. And as history testifies, the French would find themselves again under the rule of a dictator. All in all, not the happiest of endings, yet France still set the fires of revolution across Europe. And seeing the monarch of France ousted from power, radicals throughout Europe caught the revolutionary spirit. Unfortunately, most would meet a similar fate to that of France. In Germany, radical groups began calling for the unification of German states. And when Kaiser Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia folded under the demands to create a Prussian assembly, the people of the German provinces became hopeful for themselves. And soon radicals from all over the German state convened at the Frankfurt Assembly in order to work toward the unification of German provinces. And although the assembly did make some progress, the lack of a strong leader kept their hopes from becoming a reality. And a similar scene played out in Central Europe as the people called for freedom from Prince Metternich and his Austrian Empire. And at first, things looked rather promising for the revolutionaries. And now you may be asking, what about Prince Metternich? Why is he only a prince, but yet he's the leader of the Austrian Empire? Well, his father was the king. His father was still alive, but was kind of getting old and senile. And so Prince Metternich was running things. So at first, things looked rather promising for the revolutionaries. Vienna was taken by groups of revolutionary students and common class workers, while the nationalist Laux Kossuth inspired the people of Hungary to call for a constitution. And it seemed like the people of the Austrian Empire might just get their freedom. However, with the help of a strong army, the Austrian Empire regained control. And from Vienna to Prague to Budapest, rebellion was crushed within the empire. Now, Southern Europe also caught some of this revolutionary fever, but unfortunately, its fate was the same. Fueled by the revolutionary spirit, the radicals of Italy moved to create their own democratic state. And like their other European counterparts, the middle-class Italians called for the unification of an independent Italy free from Rome and the grips of the Austrian Empire of the North. And for some time, these rebels actually experienced some success. However, they pushed their luck a bit too far when they decided to rebel against the Pope, even going so far as to declare a guy named Mazzini as head of the Republic of Rome. And all seemed well for these rebels up until the point when Catholic France rode in to rescue their precious Pope and restore him to power. And as the rebels were no match for the French, the revolution in Italy met the same fate as the others. So in the middle of the 19th century, with all this revolution and Republican spirit blazing across Europe, a group of socialist reformers known as the Communist League convened in London to discuss these revolutions and what might society look like after the revolutions. What would be the best form of government, the best economic system for the benefit of all? And seeing the impoverished working class created by the Industrial Revolution, these reformers called for change. In order to summarize their beliefs, they charged two German philosophers with special interests in the economy, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, to write a mission statement of sorts on their behalf. And little did they know they were witnessing the birth of one of the most famous political ideologies of all time, Marxism and its Communist Manifesto. So let's talk a little bit about Marx and Engels here. And before we get into the specifics of these very famous men and their manifesto, it's important to understand the time in which they lived. As philosophers living in the 19th century, both Marx and Engels were opposed to the abuses of their industrialized society and how it treated lower classes particularly. To them, the Industrial Revolution was to blame for the oppression of the working class poor, who lived in slums and faced dangerous working conditions. Making matters worse, while the poor suffered, the wealthy thrived. And Marx and Engels felt this exploitation of the poor was the basis for all social and political conflict. The only way to end this conflict was through social class revolution and the abolishment of private property. And this belief, which has come to be known as Marxism, would be touted by Marx and Engels' followers for years to come, even into today. Still, the most assigned author in colleges in any liberal arts program is Karl Marx. Excuse me. And even more important, this would become the foundation for communism, or the community owning everything for the benefit of the community. So therefore, when studying the 1848 Communist Manifesto, we're really exploring the hallmarks of communism, a political ideology based on the teachings of Marx, calling for collective ownership of property with wages based on skill and need rather than the accumulation of personal wealth. Now, on to the meat of the manifesto. As previously stated, the Communist Manifesto explains the hallmarks of communism. In it, Engels and Marx shared the belief that at the basis of all history and social conflict is the struggle between classes. The wealthier class, known as the bourgeoisie, were those who owned the means of production, the factory owners, the employers. In other words, they were the ones who profited from free trade and private property ownership. So to help us remember, we'll call them the bourgeoisie businessmen. And to Marx and Engels, the bourgeoisie made their money on the backs of the wage-earning poor class, known as the proletariat, or to use some alliteration, those who were property poor. And we'll have to finish up tomorrow because I'm running out of time here today. So I appreciate you being with me here today. Go outside, enjoy. It looks like it's going to be a beautiful day out there. And I will be live back tomorrow with you, and we'll finish up talking about the Communist Manifesto and Marx's impact on Europe at the time. So until then, have a great day.